Remember, if we are taking the square root of a negative number, it's considered to be imaginary. So the square root of negative 4 is 2i. Also, recall the powers of I and how the value of an imaginary number repeats every fourth exponent. So I to the first power is the square root of negative 1, which is just I. I squared is the square root of negative 1 squared, which is negative 1, and so on. Let's use these facts to multiply radical expressions that contain negative radicands. Simplify radical expressions that have a negative by taking out I first. Then perform the indicated operations. Simplify any expression that has a power of I greater than 1. So here, we can change this, we can rewrite this as I times the square root of 16 times I times the square root of 9. Then we can multiply them together, so this becomes I squared. So we have, this is 4, this is 3, so we have 4 times 3, which is 12, times I squared, which is negative 12, since I squared is negative 1. Here we can rewrite this with i's instead. Then we have I times I, which is I squared, the square root of 450. So then we can simplify this into 225 square, or 225 times 2. The square root of 225 is 15. So then we have this 15 out front, we have this I squared, and then we have a leftover 2, and then I squared is negative 1. Here we can write this with an I instead of a negative sign. The square root of 16 is 4, and then the square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. Here are some examples. Alright, so let's rewrite this negative sign as an I out front. So negative I times the square root of 45a squared. Now we can cancel out the squared, move this a out front, and we have to put it into absolute values because it has an even exponent here, but it will have an odd exponent out front. So negative I times the absolute value of a times the square root of 45. Now 45 can be written as 3 squared times 5. 3 squared is 9 times 5. So then we can cancel out that squared, move this 3 out front, and that leaves us with negative 3i times the absolute value of a times the square root of 5. Alright, moving on. Let's rewrite this with i's instead. So we have I times the square root of 4m squared n to the 4th times I times the square root of 24m to the 4th times n. So let's combine those i's. We have I squared, and now let's reduce some things in here. We have 4, so that's 2 squared. We have m squared, and n to the 4th is n squared squared. And in this one over here, we have 24, which is 2 squared times 6. We have m to the 4th, which is m squared squared, and an n. Alright, so this is negative 1. So I'll just put a negative sign. We have this squared, so this 2 is going to move out front. We have m squared, so this m is going to move out front in absolute values. So let's start writing these out. We have 2, we have absolute value of m. We can cancel that one out and put n squared out front. N squared. And then this one we have another 2, so this 2 moves out front. So 2. This 6 is going to stay inside. We have this squared we can cancel and move this m squared out front. M squared. And then we have an n left over. So what's left over in the radical is just 6n. Alright, and all of these are multiplied together, so let's figure that out. So we have negative 2 times 2, so negative 4, times absolute value of m cubed. We need to keep those absolute value signs since this is still an odd exponent. And we have n squared times the square root of 6n. So that's our simplified version. Now finally we have this one over here. So if I just take both i's out and multiply them together, we know that will be I squared times the square root of 3, and I'm going to rewrite p cubed as p squared times p. Then this other square root is going to be 3 squared times 3, which is 27, times p. Alright, so then this squared is going to cancel out. We're going to move this p out front, in absolute value signs. So we have, we'll go down here, I squared times absolute value of p, and this 3 and that p are going to stay under the radical. Here we can take this 3 out front. This 3 remains and that p remains. So then we have this radical, which is 3p, times another radical, which is, so this one's gone, so 3p again. So if we multiply 3p times 3p, we get, or the square root of 3p times the square root of 3p gives us 3p. So we have 3i squared absolute value of p times 3p. So 3 times 3 is 9. The absolute value of p times p is just going to give us p squared because now we have an even exponent. And then we have I squared, which is negative 1. So negative. And that is our answer. And there are all the answers.